as one of the highest red meat producers in the world, surely the export market is a very valuable sales channel for our industry. Maybe that's what I think. Maybe I'm wrong. Is that the case, though, Dewald?
Yes, you're correct. Traceability per se and our markets are very important to us. And I think the exports is a very, very big portion of it with regards to how we stabilize markets in South Africa. During this COVID period, we exported approximately 4% or up to 4% of our red meat. And that created stability within the country with regards to our prices and our outflow of our meat. So, yes, it's definitely important.
Now, here to discuss export opportunities with us, please welcome Mr. Martin Cameron, economist from Northwest University and Trade Advisory. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Mac.
Welcome.
Thank you, Dewald.
Please just tell us about yourself, who you are, where you come from, what do you do?
Well, obviously, the fact that I'm associated with the Northwest University was in the introduction. We are a spin-out company of the Northwest University, and we were actually developed to take the academic IP that has been developed over the last 25 years to help exporters identify realistic export opportunities, to put that into commercial practice to help industry and companies be more successful at exports.
Maybe a follow-up question on that is, who would you do work for specifically?
So we deal with, from a national perspective, your Departments of Trade and Industry, Department of Agriculture and Forestry. Nowadays, it's called, in acronym terms, DALRRD. And then also export sectors, such as yourselves, also in terms of the red meat, particularly the pork industry, and then individual companies. There are companies that want to develop their own export potential, and if they do it in the right way, they should look at facts, and that's where we come in. They approach us and we help them define and develop an export strategy that, in the most cases so far, have helped them to be more successful.
I don't know if you want to say this. Do you work only with national companies or international companies?
We actually do work internationally, so we have clients all over the world, and most recently we even managed to get the Australian Trade and Investment Promotion Agency for the state of Queensland to become a client of ours. And it happened to be that I was in Queensland when COVID hit, and we were doing a presentation, and suddenly the phone started ringing, and it was going crazy because China just closed their agricultural exports from Australia into China, and everybody was in a panic.
So, Martin, what we're currently looking at is, and we've had discussion this morning with regards to compartmentalization and with regards to traceability, but for an economist and sitting within the public sector and obviously advising, how does export really affect us? And maybe a follow-up question after that, which we need to look at, is where do we export to?
Okay. So first of all, the question about exports, I think people need to realize that individuals, human beings, trade. That's what we've been doing for thousands of years. And when governments start talking about closing down and protecting the economies, that's kind of counterintuitive and counter-natural for human beings. We were designed and meant to trade globally and with each other, around the corner with a cafe or across the seas. So trade is very important, and in the South African context, we are one of the most open economies in the world. And if I say open, we look at a measure called the openness calculated by looking at total trade, imports and exports, relative to your production of your economy. We are close to 70% of our economy. When the economists call the number GDP and how big we are, people don't realize 70% of that, in South Africa's case, is related to trade, either imports or exports or both. So it's extremely important for South Africa as a market to continue to trade, because our domestic market is just way too small to grow and to create wealth for everybody. If we were only dependent on the domestic market, we would still be in the previous era of barter trade.
And then obviously going forward, is we're looking at, obviously in the beef industry, I can say, we've heard, I'm going to name China, for example. We've got a big drive and a focus, and everybody's eyes light up when they hear there's a possibility of exporting to China. Is China the end goal?
Well, that's an interesting one, Dewald, and I think biggest always attracts the most attention, but biggest is not always best, especially depending on your capabilities in terms of production and delivery capabilities. So within the meat industry, red meat particularly, yes, China is big. Southeast Asia is big, as a matter of fact. But if you look at, we've developed a methodology to help identify, based on facts, where the what we call realistic export opportunities are. And if you actually look at that, a market like South Korea is better positioned for South African exports of beef, as an example, than, for instance, China. That doesn't mean that China is not a good market. The point is just that there is information, there is intelligence that can help us actually identify, in most cases, better opportunities than those that are the obvious ones. And unfortunately, most of the times, the so-called large ones are the ones that are obvious. There are opportunities in Eastern Europe, as an example, where consumption patterns and standards in terms of the way of doing business, etc., are much closer aligned with South Africa, for instance, than even the Far East and Southeast Asia. Yet we don't trade a lot with those markets, and they eat meat, and not only beef, but also pork, and even chicken. So in the Middle East area, for instance, Saudi Arabia is one of the largest markets. We supply very little to Saudi Arabia. Yes, there's the Muslim aspect to it as well, so you need to be in the position to produce and deliver in a halal way. And generally, for any food production in the world, if you don't produce halal, you exclude yourself from about 30% of the global population. So these factors all play a role, but the point is, if you look at the data and the information that's available, there are many what I call unusual suspects, the not so big, not so in-your-face opportunities, which we should be pursuing.
If we pursue, what have you seen? I mean, you just said you were in Australia when COVID hit. How are we, I mean, South Africa, perceived in the rest of the world with regards to, we say 70% of our GDP comes from import-export. How, if you can answer it, how do the rest of the world perceive us? I mean, for example, Australia.
Well, if we look at the particular question of Australia, if you followed in the media, Australia's biggest trade partner was China, and still is China. And the Prime Minister of Australia actually was in the forefront of accusing China of being negligent regarding the handling of information and reporting on the COVID crisis. And as a result of that, China started imposing bans against Australian, especially agricultural exports, such as the beef and other produce. They actually have actively started looking at finding alternative trading partners. And not only is that the case for Australia, but many American companies, there are a couple of surveys that one can quote, where they've actually said that now they have a strategy for China plus one. So they want more than just China as the base of production and supply, as well as a target market, because they were burnt in this instance with China. So that's where we have an opportunity. Everybody's looking for alternative partners in the new shuffle in the world trade. And as South Africa, we should be savvy about positioning ourselves to capitalize on this opportunity, because the reality of the matter is it's not going to come to us. We've got to go to the market. If we don't make the market aware of our products, they're not going to buy from us. You're asking the question, how do they view South Africa from a, call it, macro political perspective? Not well at this point in time. That's the reality. And we can't get past that. We have had a track record over the last 10 odd years, which was not conducive to improved relations with a lot of countries. But at the same time, I think the world is all sitting back at the moment and saying, COVID is here, we are in the new normal, we need to look at alternative opportunities, alternative relationships, and in that sense, now is the opportunity to foster and develop those relationships for alternative supply partnerships.
Now, I'm very sure that, the trade market, there are a lot of challenges behind it. Are there actually other trade markets that refuse to trade with South Africa? And if so, what is the problem and what is the solution behind that?
Oh, Mac, that's a mouthful.
Yeah.
Because the answer is, yes, there are many problems. They change over time. They can happen overnight. Some of them are politically driven. Some of them are commercially driven. Some of them are vested interests driven. So the reality of the matter is trade is not for anybody. But at the same time, when you put yourself on the other side of the table and you're a supplier into a domestic economy that you're responsible for, you want to have sustainable partnerships, sustainable quality trade that's delivered on a regular and predictable basis. And I think most people are of nature wanting to have stability and willing to trade with you in a sufficiently substantial and sustainable way that it makes sense to build those relationships. Because make no mistake, it takes time and money to build the relationships. But at the same time, we have somebody like Donald Trump, which is, he's heading the most powerful economy, depending on who you believe and who you read, the second or the third or the first powerful economy in the world. And he can actually, at a whim, change a trade deal or take his pen and draw a line through it. So in that sense, it is also tough at this stage for exporters and international traders that the global arena is in flux. And Europe is up against China, Australia is up against China, the US is against China and everybody else. At this stage, they want to do their own thing. Interesting fact, the US, the measure of openness that I mentioned earlier, most people see the US playing a very big role in the global economic stage, and they do. But did you realize that they are extremely closed from a trade perspective? Only about 22 to 25% of their GDP comes from trade. So 80% of their domestic economy is driving their GDP. And that puts them in a position where most other countries can't be, that they are, to a large degree, self-sufficient on many, many fronts, which we are not.
Just a quick one before we wrap it up, just for interest's sake, right? Which country actually is at number one when it comes to the trade industry, especially when it comes to red meat? Who's sitting at number one?
That's
where are we as South Africa?
So I think the first thing that you have to realize and that you have to ask Dewald is, what is red meat?
Yeah.
Because it's not one thing.
Yeah.
And in that game, there are different products, there are different markets that favor different products. As an example, which country in the world do you think imports the most goat meat? Our boerbokke?
Yeah.
Take a guess.
Australia.
Well, I was going to say South Africa, but then I'm
Imports the most goat meat.
That's a quick fire shot.
Kuwait.
I don't know. South Africa? Let's take a chance.
No, the US.
The US!
Yes. Did you know that the US took our boerbokke and they crossed it with Swiss goat's cheese bokke, and they made a new breed of boerbok that is now good for meat and for cheese?
Whoa.
Did you know that Australia came to South Africa and learned from us in terms of our boerbokke, and now they've got more boerbokke than us? And they are selling the biggest share of exports of boerbok meat goes into the Middle East from Australia. They've actually got what they call specialized halal processing zones to make meat and to take it into the Muslim markets.
I've been saying this. The other countries, to a far or to a great extent, comes to South Africa. They see what we do. They take it with money, let's call it then maybe government money or funded money, and perfect what we do, and then they sell our ideas.
Well, I wouldn't say it's our ideas, but they've taken the idea and perfected it. It's similar to saying that the Japanese now are making such good cars because they stole the idea for making cars from America.
From America. We had the idea with the
That's the idea with global trade. Remember, it is a interchange and assimilation and improvement of ideas as well as products. That is what trade is about. We wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be able to do this if it wasn't for technology that was evolved through the fact that people trade. So trade in that sense is good. It's not bad, and they don't compete with us. They're just better than us. And we need to improve.
And there we go, ladies and gentlemen. That was Mr. Martin Cameron, economist from Northwest University and Trade Advisory. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mac. Thank you, Dale.